Hello, everyone, and thank you, Nick and the other panelists, for an interesting discussion just now. Thanks to all our attendees for joining this event today. Really pleased with what we've seen so far. So this next discussion is going to be sort of covering the sanctions landscape, in particular covering some of the key challenges that we see for APAC financial institutions. I'm pleased to have some high-level experts with us here today, who I'd like to introduce first. So first we have Nick Turner, an AML and sanctions expert with Steptoe and Johnson in Hong Kong. Nick specializes in economic sanctions, international regulation, and compliance. Many of you might have seen him cited in the media whenever there's any uncertainties regarding global sanctions regime or activity. Welcome, Nick.
Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. Next, we have Sasha Erskine, a research analyst at the Center for Financial Crime and Security Studies at RUSI. So Sasha's research focuses on counter-proliferation finance, the use of sanctions in foreign policy. I know there's a few themes around North Korea and Iran that we'll be able to talk about as well. Welcome, Sasha.
Thanks, Manesh. Thanks for having me.
Excellent. And finally, we have Ankur Kumar, head of APAC research for Refinitiv's World Check. So Ankur is responsible for client engagements as it relates to sanctions, law and regulatory enforcement issues, including PEP's financial crime related screening. Welcome, Ankur.
Good to be here, Manesh. Thanks.
Thanks. And again, thanks to the three of you for joining us. To kick off, I'd like to ask Nick to maybe set the scene and describe for our listeners some of the major changes that we've seen, say, in the last half year. What are the main sanctions issues that you see as most relevant to APAC financial institutions today?
Sure. Well, it's a long list, and I'll try to keep it short and to the point. And I'm glad that you're limiting me to the last year. I think if we went back any further, we could be talking about this all day. Asia has really become the world sanctions hotspot. Most of the new sanctions that are coming out of the United States, whether we're talking about SDN designations or entity list designations, are in some way connected to the Asia Pacific, in particular China and Hong Kong. So let me give a brief summary of what we're tracking. Obviously, Myanmar has been a major development because sanctions which were lifted in 2016 are now back in place to a large extent. The United States has led the charge with several of its allies in developing a coordinated but targeted approach to sanctions in response to the coup that took place in Myanmar in February of this year. I want to highlight that these are targeted sanctions. Myanmar, under the old sanctions regime, that was a comprehensive program. It applied to the territory. These are targeted at specific individuals, companies, and bodies within the government of Myanmar. The government as a whole is not sanctioned. The central bank is not sanctioned, but specific individuals and bodies are. So that means that name screening is going to be the key control coupled with effective due diligence of entities located in the country. Of course, on the China front, we've had lots of major developments. The first one I want to talk about is Executive Order 13959. That's the executive order that created the so-called Communist Chinese Military Companies List, or CCMC list, back in November. That was revised in June. And so we're not talking about CCMCs anymore. We're talking about Chinese military industrial complex companies. And again, this is a screening issue. It's one that relates to US persons and their ability to buy and sell publicly traded securities of those companies. The revised executive order that was introduced in June had a lot of good news in it. It actually simplified the issue in a lot of ways and made the name screening task much, much simpler. We also have a number of entity list designations. That's from the Commerce Department's Bureau of Industry and Security that relates to US export controls, mainly focused on the Xinjiang region and certain other Chinese companies. And finally, Hong Kong. You would have seen on Friday there was a quote unquote business advisory published by several departments of the US government that provides the US government's views on certain recent political developments in Hong Kong. That is not a regulation. It does not impose any legal obligations, but it is information that the US government thought was important, and it does raise certain compliance challenges for companies in Hong Kong. There were also SDN designations along with that advisory. 7 officials in the liaison office in Hong Kong were named as SDNs. That means that we need to be screening for them because US persons are prohibited from dealing with them directly or indirectly, and they're not able to process transactions through the US financial system. That's just a very brief update, setting the scene, but I hope I pointed to some of the tools that the US government is using, and we can talk about those issues more throughout the panel. Thanks, Manesh.
Thanks so much, Nick. Again, quite a lot to unpack there. We could indeed spend hours on this. I would like to delve on some of those areas a bit more in detail in a moment. But maybe we can first ask Sasha to speak a bit about a recent trend for some of this sanctions activity to be coordinated between different jurisdictions. I know most of it is led by the US, but yeah, maybe you have a few thoughts on that, Sasha?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks, Manesh. So as you say, within the past year, we've seen increasing use of not only more coordinated sanctions measures, but also that these sanctions measures have been increasingly human rights and corruption focused. And this coordinated human rights focus has been largely spearheaded by Western countries, namely the US, the UK, the EU, and Canada. So, for example, this has included sanctions targeting the Belarusian President Lukashenko, as well as a variety of other measures. Now, we know that the more coordinated that a sanctions measure is, the greater chance of achieving its objective and rendering specific concessions from the targeters. And what we think will be interesting going forward is not only whether this coordination is successful, but also whether successful coordination is then taken up in further spheres. So, for example, going beyond country-level sanctions and using the G7 platform as a potential sanctioning space. As we know, within the G7, Japan remains the only country to not have a human rights sanctions regime in place. And over the past year, we have seen developments within Japanese political circles to establish a human rights regime that can sanction targets it perceives of alleged human rights abuses. And now, looking at the situation in Myanmar, as Nick drew on, this could prove important and pertinent going forward. Where we've seen the military previously weather the effect of Western sanctions by accessing more local markets, such as that of Japan. So in closing off Myanmar's access not only to the yen, but also to other currencies such as the euro, the pound, and the US and Canadian dollar, we could see significant progress within not only human rights sanctions, but also within coordinated sanctions more broadly, and continuing this trend in coming years.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Sasha. So I think between you and Nick, we've sort of highlighted a lot of the complexities that we're seeing out of sanctions, generally speaking. So I guess, Ankur, to pull you into the conversation, I mean, we often hear about sanctions being more of a data and technology challenge rather than a regulatory challenge. Can you speak about some of the sanction screening practices that financial institutions are sort of using, some of the work you're doing with them, and what are some of the unique challenges that you're seeing in Asia?
Sure, Manesh. So very, very briefly with regards to the screening practices, I think a few of the basic best practices for sanction screening would be firstly to screen against the best sanctions data. And how do you define that? It basically incorporates all information given by the sanctions body, plus adds whatever risk-relevant information about the sanctioned person or entity from the public domain as quickly as possible. For screening, this will eliminate both false negatives, which from a sanctions perspective is very, very critical, but also more eliminate the false positives, because the more information there is about a person or entity, especially with regards to secondary identifiers, the faster you can eliminate false positives. This is true especially in relation to all sanction lists, of course, but especially with regards to narrative sanctions and complying with rules like OFAC 50% and similar rules for EU, UN, where there's a clear blocking obligation for linked entities as well. So this sanctions relevant data should be made available for screening as fast as possible, preferably within 24 hours. Best screening software is also necessary, would help you with setting up your risk-based approach to an acceptable threshold, exact matches, fuzzy matches, etc. Plus, like with all name screening, customer data needs to be very well prepared as well. So best KYC data is very critical as well. Lastly, I would also say that everyone needs to have a good risk-based approach, needs to incorporate what you want to screen against. So when we think of sanctions, we tend to think of just the major sanction lists, OFAC, EU, UK, UN. But there are actually hundreds of sanction lists globally based on your business and based on where you're operating. You may decide on which lists you don't really want to screen against. With regards to challenges from a nation perspective, there are quite a few, to be honest. Firstly, the significant range of naming conventions in the region is a big one. So, for instance, the presence of single names in Myanmar and Indonesia, they are fairly well understood, but not everyone in Indonesia has a single name, for instance. So if you're dealing with a single name, you need to understand whether it's a partial name, for which obviously you need more information, or whether it's a full name. Plus, not everyone knows that single names are actually common in other countries as well, like China and India, in certain scenarios. For instance, in China, certain ethnic groups like Tibetans only have a given name and no surname at all, but most Chinese have a surname. In India too, for certain countries, there's only a single name. Transliteration methods also differ across the region. So while there are countries like China where there's a standard romanization method, Honey Pinyin, there are different ways to do this transliteration for others. And sometimes an empirical approach is also taken to transliterate, and I think that requires a deep understanding of local naming conventions as well. Another thing, certain countries have very, very common names, which increases the likelihood from a false positives perspective. In Vietnam, for instance, just one family name, Nguyen, accounts for 40% of all names in Vietnam. In Korea, that figure is just 3 family names accounting for 45% of all names. And I could go on and on. Chinese names are quite common as well. Titles, honorifics can also be a bit of a challenge in the region. So for instance, in Malaysia and Brunei, they are used very, very extensively, and not just in royal family settings. So you need to be able to figure out which part of the name is the title and which part is actually the name. And that may have an impact on your screening results as well, depending on what settings you choose. Even gender, sometimes it's not always clear as well for all countries. Chinese names, for instance, it's very hard to tell gender from just the name. And you need data that can try to find gender, or a data provider that can try to find this by either trying to find the ID where gender is specified in China, or trying to find sources where there's an image or other information where gender can be gleaned from. And obviously, there are certain scenarios where the sanctions body specifies gender. So in that case, you don't need it. So essentially, you need to be working with screening data that's rich with identifiers such as date of birth, age, ID, even things like gender and titles that are clearly highlighted. Plus, it should also have local language aliases in different scripts which are available, because they're also quite great identifiers as well.
Okay, thanks so much, and you've really highlighted, a big challenge, I guess, for financial institutions in terms of the volume of data, the number of different lists that they might have to keep track of. Nick, we have talked about this before, actually. Just sort of given the variety of sanctions, regulations, orders, and lists that are all in play at once from different jurisdictions. I wonder if you could also maybe spend a moment helping to clarify for our audience what some of these different lists means, particularly the ones that have been in focus recently, the entity list, CMIC list, and so on?
Sure, happy to do that. And I want to pick up on a point that Ankur made, which is sometimes companies want to choose not to screen against certain lists, and that's a way of managing the volume of alerts. And in some cases, that's a perfectly acceptable approach from a regulatory point of view. But in order to make those decisions, you need to know what the lists are meant for. And each one has a different purpose. If they only had one purpose, there would just be one list. But because each list is different, we need to understand what exactly it's trying to achieve. So the major ones that you've probably heard of are the specially designated nationals list from OFAC, or the U.S. Office of Foreign Assets Control. And those are basically asset freezes. So most UN sanctions are incorporated into the OFAC list, as well as many autonomous sanctions, and many of those designations are coordinated with allied countries like Canada, the UK, and the EU. Then you have something called the sectoral sanctions list, and that is different than the SDN list. It's focused on Russia. It identifies companies in the energy, defense, and financial sectors, and there are restrictions on how US persons can deal in debt and equity. And in some cases, there are export control restrictions. We also have that CMIC list, and this is the list of Chinese military industrial complex companies, CMIC, and this replaces the old CCMC list for sanctions purposes. These are companies which are identified by the Treasury Department, and under an executive order called 13959, US persons are prohibited from purchasing or selling publicly traded securities of those companies, or publicly traded securities that are derivative of or designed to provide investment exposure to publicly traded securities of CMICs. And finally is the entity list. I think that's the other big one. The entity list is published by the Commerce Department from its Bureau of Industry and Security, or BIS, and it's an export control list. In fact, it's not really a sanction per se, it's a licensing requirement imposed on items which are subject to the Export Administration regulations. So if you think about those lists, you might think that in a trade finance context, it might be useful to screen against the entity list sometimes, but maybe not against the CMIC list, because that has to do with securities, not really a trade finance issue. Similarly, if you're doing wire transfer screening, might not make sense to screen against the entity list, because you're not going to be responsible for the underlying goods which the export controls apply to. But in a trade finance circumstance, it might make sense to do a little screening there. So by understanding these different lists, what they're intended to do, you can make really refined decisions about your screening program. And I think that's helpful for managing volumes.
Awesome. Ankur, do you think Nick has missed anything there that you want to highlight?
Not really. I think he has covered all the relevant lists, especially in relation to China and Hong Kong, quite well.
Okay, cool. Nick, I do think there's still potentially a bit of a confusion about what the new anti-foreign sanctions law of China means for financial institutions. Could you help clear some of this up, and in particular explain what the implementation date, August 2nd, means for financial institutions?
Sure. So August 2nd relates to Executive Order 13959. So those are the CMICs and the restrictions on U.S. persons trading in those securities. That takes effect on August 2nd. The anti-foreign sanctions law from the PRC is a recent development where the National People's Congress has adopted legislation to provide additional legal authority for actions taken by various ministries, including the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of Commerce. It received a lot of headlines, but I think if you were paying attention to how this was developing over time, you would realize that the anti-foreign sanctions law did not really introduce things that weren't already being talked about from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of Commerce. The reason we need to pay close attention is because it signals that China will be developing a framework for responding to foreign measures which are viewed as threatening China's sovereignty, domestic affairs, or development interests, and we'll need to pay close attention to those risks. In cases where there's a conflict of law, where a company may need to make a choice about which regime to follow, that's a case-by-case decision. But I think we can look to the EU blocking regulation and other similar regulations for some ideas of how we can manage that, because these are issues that companies have addressed in Europe and other places. And so we have a lot of strategies that we can use that will probably be applicable to the situation in China as well.
Thank you, Nick. And I guess just knowing that I guess I just want to touch on the Myanmar sanctions or Myanmar-related sanctions, let's say, a bit further, because I know it's quite a big concern for Southeast Asia, particularly Singapore as well. What do people need to understand about the sanctions related to Myanmar?
Well, the guidance that I think is most helpful is guidance which is given in the context of the Hong Kong program, the Venezuela program, and which was given under the old Myanmar program and the old Sudan program. And this has to do with, what do we do when a government official is sanctioned? Does that mean that their whole office is sanctioned? Does it mean that every government body or entity that they control, does that mean that they're sanctioned? And OFAC is really clear. They say no. The OFAC SDN sanctions focus on the person who is named and any legal entity which is owned 50% or more by them. And unlike the EU, OFAC is really concerned with ownership, not control. And so when we have a situation where a government official is sanctioned, if they own something 50% or more, then that legal entity will be subject to the same blocking sanctions. But if we're talking about an office that they run, if we're talking about a ministry, if we're talking about a state-owned entity, so on and so on, if all they have is control, that doesn't mean that that entity is subject to the blocking sanctions. So there's many FAQs on this, and it's important to remember that, because with Myanmar, lots of government officials, key ministers are sanctioned, and that we need to understand the effect that has on the government bodies.
Thanks, Nick. Ankur, I know you've talked about some of the challenges specific to APAC already, but I wonder, are there any specific challenges related to the China and Myanmar sanctions against entities and individuals that you're seeing, from a screening perspective?
Sure, Manesh. So yeah, I think a number of huge challenges that we have seen. I already spoke about challenges associated with naming conventions and gender, and these challenges are definitely present in both cases. As I said, gender is not always specified for Chinese names, and considering the large universe of these names, it's really challenging to deal with the false positives, even if other identifiers are present. For Burmese names, the local Burmese aliases are often, in fact, in almost all scenarios, not provided by OFAC or other sanctions bodies, and that's really a great identifier to have when it comes to screening. But even more importantly, like Nick also briefly mentioned, the scale of the sanctions in some of these cases is quite astonishing, as it includes state-owned entities that are very, very fully embedded in these economies, so to speak. So I'll give a couple of examples, right? So last July, OFAC sanctioned a Chinese state-owned enterprise, XPCC, or Xinjiang Production and Construction Corps, under the Global Magnitsky Human Rights Accountability Act, Executive Order 13818. Obviously, it's an SDN. The OFAC 50% rule applies for linked entities, but XPCC is no normal corporate entity. It's more of a provincial government. So it has a bureaucratic status that is equal to that of Xinjiang's regional government. It's a paramilitary organization with potentially hundreds or even thousands of subsidiaries in fields as diverse as agriculture, transportation, construction, finance, biotech. It actually provides government functions such as policing, education, healthcare. It employs more than 2.5 million people, which is roughly 10-12% of everyone in Xinjiang. It reports its revenue in GDP. So the number of entities that potentially meet the OFAC 50% rule, for which there's a blocking obligation, is in the hundreds, if not thousands, for XPCC. So one could almost say the single designation could be OFAC's largest ever. Some of the entities sanctioned in Myanmar are also similar. Initially, after the coup, OFAC or other bodies didn't really go after the two biggest military conglomerates, but after 2 months, they decided to target Myanmar Economic Corporation, MEC, and Myanmar Economic Holdings Limited, MEHL. Both are major holding companies. They own dozens of businesses spanning coal, gas, manufacturing, banking, jade and ruby mining. Neither of them pays any income tax or commercial tax. Both of them own two of the largest private banks in Myanmar. Inva Bank is owned by MEC and Mayavati Bank is owned by MEHL. They also have joint ventures with foreign partners. The reason they were sanctioned was the significant control that the military officials in Myanmar, who also control them, but their reach in Myanmar actually runs very, very deep indeed. So once again, the OFAC 50% rule is applicable in a country where ownership information is not very transparent as well in Myanmar. So when it comes to screening, you need to be working with a data provider that can go and find these entities by doing open domain research in credible Chinese or Burmese or other sources, can add local aliases, names, knows credible sources in both countries, and they know the risk landscape enough to capture this content. With respect to Chinese sanctions on individuals and entities initially in the US, but also EU, UK, and Canada, the situation over the last year and a half has been a bit challenging as well. Nick spoke about the new anti-foreign sanctions law, but for now, nobody has been sanctioned based on that. It's very recent. Then last year, we also had, 2 years ago, we also had the unreliable entity list announced by the Chinese Ministry of Commerce in May 2019. Some provisions announced last year as well, but then again, no entity has been put on the list. And then we have these various Ministry of Foreign Affairs press conferences over the last year or 1.5 years when China announced sanctions initially on a number of individuals and entities in the US, and then also EU, Canada, and UK. In some ways, they've been identical to sanctions. They were clearly defined targets, of course, but there were clear penalties as well, but there was no specific sanctions list that you could look at, and also no regulation or law that authorized these sanctions very clearly. Plus, none of the individuals or entities mentioned had any identifying information, and some of the penalties also announced were a bit vague. So, for instance, they announced that penalties also applied to family members, but didn't really name the family members, nor defined who would form part of the family unit. Sanctions also applied to companies and institutions that they said were associated with these individuals, but how the association itself is defined is still a bit unclear, whether it required ownership, for instance, or whether it was very vague ownership. Former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, for instance, would have, I would assume, dozens of associations, but whether those are impacted or not is not very clear. So to comply with these sanctions required the data to be enhanced significantly by building out these networks of family and associated entities where PEPs were concerned, and especially where there was ownership of the linked entities, and also required that these multiple press conferences be monitored, which is far more difficult than having a single sanctions list to monitor.
Wow, that's quite a lot there, that Ankur. But I think for our listeners, it kind of demonstrates that how complicated some of these issues are, and some of the factors they need to take into account when trying to account for these different risks. I would like to, mindful of time, turn the discussion to Sasha a little bit. Sasha, I know a lot of your work focuses on proliferation finance risk and sanctions evasion activities by Iran and North Korea. And I know these areas have been have come into much greater focus in recent months. The FATF has produced some guidance on proliferation finance risk. Can you talk a bit about what this means for financial institutions?
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Manesh. So in October last year at the FATF 2020 plenary, we saw the institution introduce the introduction of mandatory proliferation finance for PF risk assessments to be conducted by FATF member states. Now, this is a significant step forward, as currently counter-proliferation finance and the respective measures relating to that have thus far, under FATF standards, been limited to the implementation of targeted financial sanctions relating to proliferation finance, as encapsulated under Recommendation 7, as well as Immediate Outcome 11. So the requirement for countries as well as their respective financial sectors to conduct a proliferation financing risk assessment will certainly bring not only proliferation financing risk and our understanding of it into greater focus, but it will also serve to elevate proliferation finance alongside other existing financial crimes, which the FATF prioritizes, such as money laundering and countering the financing of terrorism. So now, drawing on the Asia-Pacific region, we can see that the requirement to undertake risk assessments regionally is particularly important for this region, as it is situated in geographical proximity to North Korea, which is the country we consider to currently represent the most urgent proliferation financing threat. Whilst we consider proliferation financing to be a global threat, jurisdictions situated in closer geographical proximity to proliferating countries, such as what we've seen with North Korea and the Asia-Pacific region, generally tend to have a higher exposure to proliferation financing risk. So for countries and financial institutions within the APAC region, conducting a proliferation financing risk assessment will highlight specific sectors of the economy which may be vulnerable to proliferation financing exposure and exploitation. Some examples of this are the insurance sector, the banking sector, shipping, or digital sectors, amongst a wide range of others. Proliferation financing risk assessments will also allow both financial institutions and countries to recognize areas where specific threats relating to proliferation finance may be prevalent within their domestic economies. This can include, for example, exploiting porous national borders, making use of vulnerable transport routes, or having a significant diaspora population which may be sympathetic to proliferating actors' concerns, amongst, again, a very wide range of additional factors. So in conducting a proliferation financing risk assessment, both financial institutions and countries alike are going to be able to recognize not only sectors that pose risks, but also become more aware of the specific typologies employed by proliferating actors, such as what we see currently by North Korea and previously employed by Iran. And these typologies have been used frequently to evade sanctions and continue their access to the formal financial system. So by putting into place robust strategies which can recognize and mitigate PF typologies through conducting risk assessments, financial institutions and countries alike will be better equipped to counter this threat going forwards.
Thank you, Sasha. You do mention that you do highlight the need for financial institutions and countries to become more aware of these typologies to evade sanctions out of by North Korea. Can you talk about some of those? What are the main typologies being used to evade sanctions? Any detail you can provide on that?
Yeah, of course. So what we've seen by North Korea, particularly since 2006, has been a wide variety of sanctions typologies employed. And we tend to find that the type of typology, as well as the sophistication of it, tend to vary significantly depending on the level of access the proliferating state, so in this case North Korea, has to a jurisdiction's formal financial system. So what we've often seen in countries with robust and established economies has been the misuse of the formal financial system. This can include exploiting correspondent banking accounts, it can include falsifying documents, as well as a wide range of other activities. In countries where they tend to be less sophisticated financial systems, we've seen more rudimentary typologies, which are often more difficult to trace. So for example, this can be the use of bulk cash withdrawals, or it can be the use of barter trade. So as we can see, the typologies are not uniform and tend to vary quite significantly. What we've also seen across economies has been the use of multiple changes of addresses, as well as increasingly false information across sectors when it comes to shipping and manufacturing of proliferation-sensitive materials, as well as other items used for the procurement of weapons of mass destruction. So, for example, we've seen in recent years that as the banking sector and the formal financial sectors have adapted to proliferation financing typologies and regulated counter-proliferation finance within their sectors, proliferating activity has extended to the non-financial sectors, particularly to that of the DNFBP sector, the designated non-financial sector, with real estate, high-value goods dealers, and gatekeepers professions, such as accountants, lawyers, and TCSPs, significantly more exposed, with these sectors more unregulated. As again, we can see proliferating financing risk and the means of evading sanctions are across the board and are not endemic to a particular sector or typology. Another interesting trend which we've seen recently has been the growing use of vessels as a means to evade sanctions, with ship-to-ship transfers, particularly of coal by North Korea, and flying under false flags of a separate jurisdiction forming key typologies as a means to evade both UN sanctions as well as unilateral sanctions imposed by respective countries.
Thank you, Sasha. That's a lot, and I'm sure we could spend a lot more time on this. We haven't even touched on cryptocurrency yet, as one of the mechanisms North Korea has apparently been using. But I do want to touch on the topic of vessels. Ankur, I know that vessels, flagged vessels, and detained vessels as well have been a key focus for Refinitiv. Can you help to explain some of the key issues that you encounter when it comes to vessel screening?
Sure. So with regards to screening, right, a few things need to be taken into consideration. Sasha already spoke about unilateral sanctions lists, but the vessels that must be screened against are not just those that are sanctioned themselves. That's a given. But it's very important to screen against vessels that are directly connected or associated with either in an embargoed or sanctioned country, region, or entity. That's a larger universe, but also relevant. This could be vessels that are flags of embargoed countries or vessels where the owner or operator has links to embargoed countries. Then an even larger but also important universe of vessels includes those that are accused of either deceptive shipping practices, such as ship-to-ship transfers, altering vessel identification, sanctions evasion, or have been found to have not complied with specific country inspections in relation to violation of international maritime regulations as per IMO conventions. The UN panel of experts often highlight vessels, Sasha already spoke about it, with sanctions risks such as those supplying oil to North Korea or those facilitating coal exports from North Korea to other countries. They do recommend that these vessels should be designated as soon as possible, but some never do, or some appear in domestic sanctions lists, such as those from Japan, Taiwan, etc. So further research on these and understanding of such local regional lists and sources are useful, and if needed, these local lists must also be incorporated in your screening. Another issue, of course, is that, like with all name screening in general, it is very important to screen against high-quality data, which in this case for vessels would be data that has all known aliases, IMO numbers, information on owners and operators of the vessels as well.
Thanks so much, Ankur. So we just have a few minutes left. I figure we could kind of go around and have each of you kind of lay out sort of your, I know nobody likes to have a crystal ball when it comes to the sanctions space. I'm looking at you, Nick. But what I'd like to hear everybody's expectations and key focus areas in the sanctions space for the next 12 months. Let's start with you, Nick.
Sure. One thing I will be watching closely is, number one, the development of coordinated sanctions with respect to various issues having to do with China. We haven't seen that so far develop with Hong Kong, but there's been some indication that allied countries of the United States may be heading in that direction eventually. But I think more recently, due to the allegations that are being made by various countries in respect of hacking by actors that may or may not be linked to the Chinese government, that could lead to the imposition of new sanctions of some sort. There's definitely been calls for that over the past few days. And so we'll be watching to see how that develops and whether that is a coordinated program with multiple jurisdictions or if it's something that belongs only to the United States. And because we've talked about these different sanctions lists, it's impossible to predict what that would look like. It could be entity list designations, it could be the SDN list, it could be new sectoral sanctions or CMIC sanctions or something new we've never heard of before. So we'll just need to watch closely to see how that develops.
Thanks, Nick. Sasha, key expectations the next 12 months?
Yeah, I would certainly echo what Nick has said, and I would also draw on the role that Iran is going to play in the next year. We see that currently as the US and Iran attempt to renegotiate the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or the JCPOA, under the Biden presidency, and a new president also takes office next month in Tehran. Sanctions on Iran, whether these are going to be continued at the US level or reimposed at the UN level, are likely to form a key part of discussions. So on the bilateral level between the US and Iran, this may include whether Tehran will accept greater restrictions than are currently imposed in renegotiating the JCPOA. This is more urgent considering just yesterday, we purportedly saw Iran's National Security Council reject the draft renegotiated nuclear deal with the US, asking us to consider what countermeasures, including harsher sanctions, the US will be taking in response to this. And going forward, I think Iran is certainly going to be, not only from a proliferation point of view, but also from a sanctions point of view, a key trend to watch.
Thank you, Sasha. And Ankur, what are your expectations over the next 12 months?
Sure. I think Sasha and Nick have already touched on some of the main points. I think looking at the sanctions today, especially with regards to Asia, with a possible exception of Iran, but as Sasha said, even that looks tricky. None of the significant sanctions-related issues seem like something that can be resolved in the next 12 months. And I think organizations do expect sanctions screening to be even more important going forward. Recently, Refinitiv did a survey and they released a global risk and compliance report that involved roughly 3,000 managers in large organizations. And this report also highlighted the point, 40% of the survey participants actually felt that sanctions compliance was a greater priority for them now than before. So going forward, I think a lot of the regulatory action could be expected from, as Nick said, US, UK, EU, Canada in relation to China, Hong Kong, and some on Myanmar as well with regards to consolidated sanctions. The key question mark here is to what extent China's new anti-foreign sanctions law is going to be implemented. If companies have to really start choosing between complying with foreign sanctions and complying with Chinese laws, then that might be slightly tricky for some of them. From a screening perspective, I would also say that the sanctions history in relation to China, Hong Kong, and Myanmar have shown that companies really need to be prepared for sudden and significant sanctions requirements. So it would be best if they are highly agile, equip themselves with both KYC and risk data that is very comprehensive to begin with, and where the sanctions data can be scaled up, added and enriched very quickly. A lot of the times over the last year or so, sanctions have been against people and entities that you do expect to be screening against in the first place. Either it's the 20 adult children and spouses of Myanmar senior military officials, or the various PEPs in China and Hong Kong, or even the Chinese sanctions on key people in the EU, UK, US. So with the right kind of data and technology at your disposal, I think you can act and manage risk fast when you do have to.
Thank you so much, Ankur. And it looks like we're actually right on time. So I'd first like to once again thank our panelists, Nick Turner, Sasha Erskine, and Ankur Kumar. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm sure, again, we could have talked about this for another hour or so, but we'll have to end here. For our listeners, if you have any questions for our speakers, feel free to reach out to them on LinkedIn, or reach out to us and we'll be happy to direct your queries to them.